I'm gonna sneeze too. My allergies. Oh.
This meeting is being recorded.
Hey, welcome to the Citizens Advisory Podcast presented by the Citizens Advisory of Pennsylvania. I am Jess Stallnecker, Executive Director, and I'm joined by our second Vice President, Amy Carrozza. Amy is also the head of our Policy and Curriculum Committee, and she does some pretty extensive research on our school district policies, their procedures, their curricula. And this is to include today's topic, which is school climate surveys. Sounds pretty harmless, but when we do a deep dive, there's more to it, as usual. I feel like every single topic that we're going to have on this podcast is the same. Like, to the average parent who has not done their homework, it sounds good on the surface. And honestly, I think I was one of those parents who just wanted it to just keep sounding good and then I didn't have to worry about it. But that's not the case. I guess these surveys are really not, we're going to just dive right in, really not the surveys we were used to as kids, where like at the end of a class, a teacher would say, hey, can you take this survey and tell me what I can improve? Or, what did you like about this class? What did you not like about this class? It's a little different. So, Amy, can you tell us, just give us a little brief overview of what our kids are, taking in schools today without really even parents knowing?
Exactly. Yeah, I think schools used to use surveys and they were really helpful, especially for teachers and administrators, like what's working and what's not working. But then I think, especially since COVID, schools have realized they can get a lot of data from surveys. And the bad part about that is that a lot of times third parties want access to that data. And then if you combine the third parties with the data that's collected, you get a sort of dark side of this survey. And I'm going to just start with what I think are two main purposes that are now being used in schools for surveys. And that's data mining. I'll explain a little bit about that. And then using surveys to increase security tracking measures on our students. Two of the things that I think after this, you'll get an idea. They're really not something that I would think most parents would want done on their students. And these surveys are taking up a lot of time that should honestly be spent probably more in academics. Yeah. These surveys, they're called different things. A lot of times they're called climate surveys, wellness checks. Sometimes they're called like equity surveys. Sometimes they're behavioral risk surveys. There's multiple types of surveys that are given. And I can guarantee some of them I know are in probably 95% of PA public schools. Others vary by school district, and you probably would just have to find out from your school exactly which surveys are being done.
Right.
But the ones that I want to focus on more today are the climate or wellness SEL type surveys, which is social emotional learning surveys. And they, like Jess said, they sort of sound like they're going to be good, but they're collecting extensive amounts of data on the students because they're being performed on their Chromebooks. So what they're able to do is there's about 100 questions usually per survey. I can give a little bit of samples later, but they take the information and they're able to build sort of like an SEL profile per student, a social emotional learning profile per student. And that is collecting the information on what the student feels about themselves, what the student feels about their other students, what the student feels about their teacher, what the student feels about their administrators, what the student feels about the school in general. And these social emotional profiles can follow your student literally from kindergarten through 12th grade. And then if they're sold to third parties, college, they could have effects that could do something to their admission to college. Like, that's not unforeseeable. Right. So that's a little bit of like the types of surveys that you need to look out for. One of the third parties, and actually it's not even a third party, what we're seeing now is because public schools accepted the American Rescue Plan money, most of the public schools. If they did, part of the strings attached to taking that money, they have to spend a certain amount of money. I think it's like 20% of what they received on SEL. And that's social emotional learning. They could spend it on the curriculum, or a lot of times schools are choosing to spend it on companies that provide surveys because it's data collection. And one of those companies is called Panorama. And this is something that's being used in Pennsylvania. You can go to the Pennsylvania Department of Education, just search on Panorama, and you will find this company. This company has been ranked #1 SEL measurement tool, probably because it's one of the only ones. Right. But it's partnered with CASEL. Some people might have heard that name before, and it's promoted by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So if you start researching all of these things, you can find out a lot of other information about that. Right. But they are a really big data collection company, and analytics, and you can go to the Panorama website and you can see samples of these social emotional profiles per student, and they're ranked by color schemes. And they sell it that teachers will be able to use it. So like if somebody does bad on a test one day, well, that's right now their profile looks like they're not doing so hot mentally or whatever. These are mental surveys.
They're supposed to be tools, but it becomes a little bit more dark than that.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I could give you, do you want me to give you some
How about
sample?
I think it's important because, again, on the surface, and I don't expect parents to do all of the research that we do, right? That's kind of why we're here. So, I think on the surface, again, like you might be asking as a parent, well, I mean, what could be wrong with, a teacher understanding mentally and emotionally where my child, stands in the moment. But as Amy was saying, first of all, that data can follow them. Those profiles, those mental health profiles, basically, can follow your child, well beyond their school years, and that could be detrimental. And some of the survey questions, again, I don't even know if some of the students would understand what it would mean to answer in a certain way in some of these survey questions that I have personally seen. But we have to remember that this is going on from K to 12, right? There's different levels. Obviously, some of the younger kids can't read. There's different levels, but like this stuff can follow them regardless of where they're at, a few years from now. So yeah, I would love some sample questions. That would be awesome.
Sure. And before I do that, I also want to say, like, the amount of surveys that these kids are taking is increasing so much that I have to wonder who is really studying the effectiveness of these surveys, when I know, like, a lot of like middle school kids, like especially like boys, like they're not taking their tests, their big tests seriously after, and even the PSSAs. My kids will come home and say half their class say they just got sick of doing it and filled in every bubble under, so are they doing that with these surveys? Because they have no idea what their answers could ultimately be doing.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So scary thought, because I mean, as a former teacher, I mean, I know like kids don't always take a survey or a test seriously. And then you've got, red flags popping up. All of a sudden you've got this mental health profile that does not describe you at all, but they're just not taking it seriously, which is such a good point. Yes. All right. So let's hear some of these questions.
And I don't know, like, I really don't know if anybody is doing studies on the effectiveness of surveying young kids, like, I don't know. But I'm going to start with one that I'm pretty sure is in every public school district in Pennsylvania. That is the PA School Climate Survey. And this is one that you can easily find. You can download the questions. They have separate ones for elementary school age kids, middle school, and high school. You can find it on the pa.gov website. But some of the same questions are asked for each grade level. And that's just basically like, you have to give the name of your school. You say your ethnicity and race, your gender, and then like what grade you're in. But then some of the other questions, they sort of segregate it to questions about your school, questions about your teachers, and questions about your fellow students. Ironically, they don't ask in this survey any questions for you to reflect on yourself as a student.
Okay.
Right. So they ask the questions about the school. Some of them will be, and the answers range from strongly disagree, agree, strongly agree,
Okay.
For the questions about your school. So some of the questions they'll say are, do you feel students at this school are teased or picked on? Do you feel students at this school are bullied? One of the questions is, sometimes I stay home because I don't feel safe at school. Do you think students at this school are threatened? Now, what I noticed about this, when you're asking about the school, they're not asking any positive questions about the school.
Right.
They're
Right.
not saying, do you feel like, students are treated fairly? Do you know what I mean? So
Yes.
no matter what the response is, it's negative.
And it's putting it in their heads right away, the way that they read
Exactly.
the question, right? Words matter. Yeah.
That's about the school. Then they'll say in the section on, they want the students to see if they strongly agree, disagree, agree, or strongly agree about other students in their school. Do you think other students really care or don't really care about each other?
See, and it's not really care about each other. It's don't really care, which
That's
is
how it is.
interesting.
It's slanted negative in every section.
Yes.
Do you feel that students don't get along together well? They just look out for themselves. Stop and think. Do you think students stop and think before doing anything when they get angry? I mean, I don't even know how another student would know if their other students are thinking like that, because they're
Right.
not having those conversations with these people.
Right.
These are the questions. Okay. Here's questions about your teachers. Do teachers often connect what you're learning to life outside of the classroom?
Okay.
Do you think teachers encourage students to share their ideas about things we're studying in class? Do you think your teachers really care about you? Do you think teachers will help you make up work after an excused absence? Those are the teacher questions. And then they end with questions about, do you think adults in this school are too busy to give you help? Do you think adults in this school apply the same rules to all students? Do you think adults in this school are willing to take time to give you help? Do you think students in this school already know the material that's being taught? Will the teacher give them more advanced assignments? I mean, I don't know how kids would know the answers to some of these, but those are the types of questions that are in this
survey.
Yes. So when you don't ask a lot of positive questions and you just have varying degrees of negative, you can sort of form the narrative that, well, no one's treating each other well, and everyone's getting bullied, and nobody feels safe. Okay. So then enter in, well, we need to do something about this. So we need more restorative justice practices for discipline. We need more security measures to keep kids from, fighting with each other.
Right.
And that's where they're getting their data that shows kids aren't safe at school. Kids don't feel safe at school. Kids are getting bullied in school. They need the Safe to Say program. We need more mental health programs. All of these things, because these are the types of surveys they're basing their
information,
decisions on. Yeah.
Right.
Those are the climate type surveys. Now I'm going to talk, I'll just give you some examples of the SEL type surveys, because these are the things that I believe, if they haven't already started, they're coming down the pike, because the next school year is when they're going to have to be focused more on SEL, because they took the ARP money and they've already factored it in.
Who are listening and who maybe listened to like our first episode we talked about ARP money. We talked about the ESSER grant. It's ESSER, and you can actually look it up on the Pennsylvania Department of Education website. And we actually, on our website under resources, we have a link to a highlighted copy of the entire ESSER grant stipulations, and you can read about this in there. And some of the things that kind of were red flags to us. That was one of the first things as an organization that was like, whoa, like, what's coming. And so that alerted us to something like these surveys, which again, social emotional learning sounds great, but here's where we're going. So yeah.
And remember, these surveys are taking place in like every subject at your kid's school in place of academic time.
Right. Exactly.
Right. So here is an example of an SEL skill survey and competency that came from Panorama Education, which again is being promoted by the Pennsylvania Department of Education. So if your school is spending SEL money on surveys, it's going to be these types of surveys. And this is per student. So they're asking, they sort of frame it to your student that whether a person does well or poorly in school depends on a lot of different things. You may feel that some of these things are easier for you to change than others. So in school, how possible is it for you to change? And here are some examples. Being talented. So they're asking kids, is it possible for you to change being talented? Is it possible for you to change giving a lot of effort? Is it possible for you to change behaving well in class? Is it possible for you to change liking the subjects you are studying? How easy do you give up? What is your level of intelligence? Is it possible to change your level of intelligence? Mm-hmm. And that's your performance in school section. And your answers range from it's not at all possible to change, little possible to change, somewhat possible to change, quite possible to change, completely possible to change. Okay. So they're measuring how adaptable the student is, how, this is where you see how they could create a social emotional profile per student to see right. what type of person you are.
Right.
Your behavior questions are, how often are you polite to adults? Almost never, once in a while, sometimes, frequently, almost all of the time. I don't know what this has to do with education.
Yeah.
How carefully do you listen to other people's points of view? How often are you prepared? How much do you care about other people's feelings? How often do you follow directions? How well do you get along with students that are different from you? How often did you pay attention and ignore distractions? How clearly are you able to describe your feelings? When you're working independently, how often do you stay focused? I mean, there's 30 more like this, but how often do you compliment others? How often are you polite to other students? Why do they need this information, and how reliable is it? It's
right. And then there were some others where, they might not be, again, in your student's school now, but there's some more really kind of red flag questions that we wanted to bring up, because you just never know. And you do need to be aware that these surveys are out there and that they are being given and probably closer to home than you think. And so I personally would love to hear some of those questions having to do with like, your pronouns and what
exactly
that kind of thing.
Those typically fall under they call them different things, again, depending on the school or maybe the state, but they're like federally they're called National Youth Risk Behavior Surveys. Okay. Sometimes they're just called Risk and Protective Inventory Surveys. Those are the questions that they'll be asked. The students will be asked about their sexuality, their gender identity, the preferred pronouns they want. They go into a lot of times, I have a sample right here, like, have you been arrested in the last 12 months? Have you used alcohol in the last 12 months? Have you used drugs in the last 12 months? Do you know students who use drugs? Do family members use drugs? Do family members have guns in the home? Have you, my child, let's see. Do you have good relationships with your teachers? Do you have, they mention religion too. I'm trying to find that. Oh, they want to know if you live in an area where there's a lot of illegal drugs and acts of violence. Do you belong to a nurturing faith community? Do you live in public housing? These are all, I mean, extremely invasive questions that, quite frankly, are illegal to even be asking children.
Right.
So,
So like, what do you think they're doing with this data that they collect? Like, what do you, I mean, we know that they're trying to create these mental health and social emotional profiles. Like, I mean, honestly, in our school district, I can tell you right now that even if they got a couple like red flag answers, there's no way they could wade through that information at my district and say, okay, like you need to go talk to a guidance counselor. Like that's not happening. Like I can guarantee. And in fact, and I don't know if we really have time to get into it, but there's something called the Rhythm app, which was something our school put into place. But so many parents were like on top of it and said, we opt out, that they just, after 2 weeks, it faded away. But it was especially for like the younger grades where they had to answer kind of how they were feeling that day. Were they tired? Were they hungry? And they answered with emojis. And so that made sense. It was like sort of their level, but like, so like, we kept asking as parents, okay, so once you get that information, where does it go? And like, is a guidance counselor really equipped to handle like 100 answers that are like, would technically be like a red flag, right? We're not equipped to be able to be a mental health hospital, really. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are there.
yeah, well, in the case of like Panorama, because they are a data collection and analytics company, they take all of the analyzing and reporting, and you're paying for that service. So the school is paying them to, they will provide the surveys, but then the school provides the data, and they will take the data, analyze it, and report back to the school in all kinds of metrics. They can do it by classroom, they can do it by grade, they can do it by ethnicity, they can do it by gender. And they provide all of these reports that are supposed to be used to help determine, like maybe what, in the case of Rhythm, the Rhythm company was able to create reports per classroom, so that they use the example, if you go to the Rhythm app, that if a student tests poorly, and it's out of the ordinary for that student, they would be able to look on the day they tested poorly at their Rhythm, how they answered the Rhythm questions. And they're trying to build a correlation between, if the student just said they did a mad emoji face and they did poorly, well, they probably were having a bad day. So,
Right.
Things like that is sort of how they sell it. The problem is, it doesn't always just end with the company that's providing the survey, because that company has deals with other third party, and literally no one really has any idea how many times the data is, or who all is collecting this data, because there's third party contracts. And if you start going into looking up third party rights and contracts, it's your child's data could be everywhere.
Right.
The best thing to do is just not provide the data for anything to be done with, basically.
I mean, so what, I mean, unless you have anything to share, I mean, I think maybe we, that I know it's kind of surface level, but we're hoping that you see as parents that like, these are just kind of more than meets the eye. And we do have to be like kind of diligent in looking at what's going on. And so as a parent, like, what can I do? What kinds of questions can I ask my district? What can I do to make sure that my kids' data is not being collected, they're not being profiled, and that they're getting an education and not necessarily, heading to a mental health institution every day.
Exactly. I think the first thing is, it depends on what kind of relationship you have with your teachers and your students' teachers. And I would just try to find out how many surveys are going to be given, what types of surveys are going to be given. But in my opinion, the best option is to just really opt out. And we offer with Citizens Advisory, and we have that opt out form that is in surveys. And the other thing that parents need to realize is we are already protected as parents, that our students, our children do not have to take these surveys. There are laws and protections already in place that help. Like, I mean, the Supreme Court recognizes that the parents have the ultimate say.
Right.
And we have the PPRA, which we reference a lot in the student opt-out notice, because that is the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment. It's also code 20 USC 1232. That's the code that you'll see in a lot of opt-out notices. But it was first passed in 1974. It just provides parents legal rights to review curriculum, to opt their children out of surveys, and it prevents schools from asking highly personal questions about students' sex lives, drug usage, things of that nature without parental consent. So when schools are doing this, they're breaking this law. So that's it, but it's unfortunately up to parents to remind them of that, because unless as parents we utilize our tools that we already have and laws that we already have in place, the schools will, as we have seen, trample right over them. So, but literally without a parent's consent, schools cannot require students to answer questions about all of these things that we've already shown they're being asked about. Like there's types of questions that violate this survey, and it would be political beliefs or affiliations, mental problems or challenges. Mental problems or challenges could fit any of these SEL
Absolutely
surveys.
Yes, they can.
Sexual behaviors and attitudes, illegal, antisocial, self-incriminating or demeaning behavior, all of those risk profile questions would violate this. Critical appraisals of people with close family relationships, asking if you have a convicted felon in your family, asking if you have someone that's ever been in prison, is a violation of this. Relationships with lawyers, physicians, ministers, your religious beliefs or practices, and your income level. The questions, if you live in public housing, if you've ever been on welfare, that's income level questions. They're in violation of this. So if the school wants to administer a survey that's going to violate that, they have to give you the right to review it and in plenty of time, and to opt your child out of taking these surveys. So I think it's just very important that you get engaged with what's going on in your children's school, because I can guarantee you they've probably already taken at least the PA school climate survey. So I believe it was just a couple of weeks ago that it sort of was pushed across the Pennsylvania schools. So if you don't already have an opt-out notice, or we also can link a letter that you can write. There's already a template,
right? We have a template that was from, I can't remember where that was from.
It was the Parents Defending Education, maybe?
Yes, I think that's what it came from. So yes, that's a free resource. By the way, they have a really great website, Parents Defending Education, right? That's what it's called.
Yeah.
So you can go there, but we will link in the show notes, in the description of this podcast, we will link our opt-out form that you can submit to your school district in the beginning of the year. And also that letter from the Parents Defending Education. We will link that letter template so you can create it, you can modify it, and you can send it to your school as well. But I think that it's really important, and I so appreciate all of the research that you've done. I don't think that I mean, I never would have been able to do all of that, but the research and the information that you provided is so valuable to parents. And I just think that, you know, we oftentimes just sort of send our kids off to school and we're like, yeah, like everything will be, you know, everything's going to be just fine. And they're learning all the right things, and they're, you know, doing all the right things in there. And I have so much faith in my kids' teachers that I don't even think that they would ever, you know, I don't even know if they know what the implications are. So I'm not, you know, I never want to throw teachers under the bus, because I know how it is as a former educator. When you're asked to give something, like, you just do it, and you don't necessarily even read the questions beforehand, right? This came from the state. Here you go. Give it to your kids. Like, okay. Right. So I think it's so important to just be aware and, like you said, to be engaged. So I'm so thankful, Amy, that you joined me today to explain.
Thank you. I also want to, I should have said this too. I think it's really important, especially if you have kids that are, you know, old enough to to read and sort of understand. So probably, you know, 3rd, 4th grade, talk to them about the surveys, because these kids, they don't understand that there's anything could potentially be wrong with surveys. And so they're not necessarily going to come home and say, I took a survey today.
Right.
But because I told my kids that I don't want them taking surveys, and in fact, I think it's not a bad idea to have like laminated copies of the opt-out form in their backpack. So if they are suddenly presented with a survey and they say, I'm not allowed to take this, and the teacher's like, oh yeah, it's okay, they can show like, no, I don't. But my kids now know, and they will come home and they will say, I was asked to do a survey, I didn't have to, but this was the survey that it was. Like, if you tell your kids to be on the lookout, you'll be surprised that there's surveys that just pop up out of nowhere. In fact, we had a friend of ours that her kid was asked ridiculous political surveys
Yes.
that absolutely had.
Yes.
Yeah.
Our minds were blown. We were
Yeah.
like, this has nothing to do with education. This was talk about slanted in a direction, right? The questions were very political in nature, very slanted, even mentioned.
And for 8th grade.
Right.
8th grade.
Even mentioned political figures, right? Which was bizarre, like very bizarre. So I think it's such an important topic, and hopefully, you know, parents can use this information in a way that's effective. And hopefully, you know, we always want you to feel empowered as parents to be able to make good decisions for your kids. So Amy, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll be talking to you again, right?
Yes.
This is just the beginning. We've got lots to talk about, including the rhythm app and like, where are we going, right? With these surveys. These surveys are what are being used to bring certain things into the school to solve a problem, which we'll talk about in another episode, but really important stuff, Amy. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It was my pleasure.
All right. Join us next time.
Bye, everyone.